In the talk today, we're going to be looking at values again, as we have been the last couple of talks, and we'll continue to for a couple of talks. And in particular about how you acquire values and how values are a means by which you can determine what problems you want to solve. And the case study we're going to look at today is another kind of founding father, Thomas Jefferson. I have some hesitation, as I mentioned with Alexander Hamilton, about using these founding fathers as examples or case studies, because we tend to think of them as, dead white guys. And they seem kind of larger than life, not real human beings. But I want us to look at Thomas Jefferson in this talk as just a regular human being. How did he grow up and how did he acquire the values that he did? In some ways, there's an interesting comparison between Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Both of them were redheaded. Both of them had blue eyes. Both of them were considered to be very handsome guys in their era. Both of them were real ladies' men. Both of them got into trouble over that too. Both of them had romantic liaisons that were scandalous. Both of them also were very charismatic and very successful. They also were both lawyers by training. They also, both of them lost their father at an early age, and that was a big blow to both of them. And both of them eventually had George Washington as a kind of surrogate father. So there's some parallels between Alexander Hamilton, who we looked at the last two talks, and Thomas Jefferson. But one thing I want to really emphasize is that there also are huge differences between these people. And they had extremely different values. It turns out they were not friends. They were in many ways enemies. And it wasn't because they were mean or they hated each other just arbitrarily, but they genuinely had different values. They just saw a different vision for what America was going to be. And that made them rivals and kind of enemies. But it's important to understand, where did those values come from? And how did Thomas Jefferson get values that were so different from Alexander Hamilton? So Jefferson grew up on a plantation in Virginia. His family was very wealthy. Their plantation was called Shadwell. And his father was a real pillar of the community, a tremendous leader in Virginia high society. So his name was Peter Jefferson. He was very tall. That was remarkable, well over 6 feet. He was also extremely strong. And he was one of those guys who, when he had workers in the field and they were having a hard time moving some heavy object, he'd just get down there and pitch in and help them out. He was a hard worker. He also was a surveyor by trade. He knew how to use surveying instruments. And he actually made the map of Virginia that was used for a century. He was the guy who went out in the countryside and mapped out the wilderness and made the very first map of Virginia. So he was a very charismatic guy. He was elected as a judge. He was elected as a sheriff. He was elected to the House of Burgesses, which was the British government's way of allowing the people in the colonies to have some say in the government. So he was very much a leader. So that was Jefferson's dad. His mother was also from a very wealthy plantation-owning family, and her name was Jane Randolph Jefferson. The Randolphs were, if anything, maybe even a more prominent family than the Jeffersons. Many of her brothers and father and so on were extremely well known in the area. And they had made a lot of money in the slave trade business. So they were big slave owners and big slave traders. And that's a lot of where their wealth had come from. So this is a guy that grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. Very wealthy family. He got a very good education. He had a private tutor for part of the time, and he went to a boarding school where he got a classical education. He was educated in Greek and Latin and all the classical texts of Western tradition. Extremely well educated as a young man. And then went on to William and Mary College, which was the only real college in that area at the time, and studied law and got a very good extended education. Then when he's 23 years old, he makes a trip up to Philadelphia and New York. Prior to that time, he was in this world of Virginia, but now he's adventuring up a little to these cities. And really, Virginia didn't have big cities. It was an agricultural area. And he did not like cities. When he went to Philadelphia and New York, he was not impressed by what he saw. And he was very, very clear in his own mind. He did not want to be a part of those urban areas. He said, in fact, laboring in the earth keeps a man's morals free from corruption. And he saw the cities as corrupt and the agricultural lands as much better and healthier place to live. As I said earlier, his father died when he was 14 years old. And so it was just his uncles had kind of taken over that family's estate and helped him out. His mother's brothers were very, very helpful. He continued to live in his mother's house in the plantation until he was 27 years old. But at the age of 27, he got a separate piece of land that was going to be his land and his plantation. And he began to build quite an enormous and handsome house, what eventually became Monticello, on this piece of property that was going to be his. So he inherits all of this wealth and high standing. He had been trained in the violin. He's very popular at parties as somebody who plays the violin really well. He was a really great dancer, very popular with the women. And eventually he marries. He marries a woman whose name is Martha Skelton. She had been married before, and her previous husband's name was Skelton. She came from a family named Wales. Her father was John Wales. They also were another prominent plantation family in Virginia, and they also had many, many slaves. And when he got married to Martha Skelton, all of those slaves came into then his household. So he already had slaves, but now he got a lot of new slaves when Martha moved to Monticello. And part of that slave group that he got was the Hemmings family. And this is just to give you a sense of the culture here. But so John Wales, Martha Skelton's father, had a long-standing affair with Betty Hemmings, one of his slaves. He had 6 children by Betty Hemmings. Now, Betty Hemmings had had 6 children by other slaves prior to that time. Then she had 6 children by John Wales. Then she had, after he died, she had another kid by another slave and another kid by another white guy. So she had 14 kids. Most of those kids moved with Martha Skelton to Thomas Jefferson's plantation at Monticello. And one of those was Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings had a long-standing affair with Thomas Jefferson and had children by him. So he was married to Martha Skelton, but he had a mistress who was Sally Hemings, and Martha and Sally would have been half-sisters because John Wales was their father. So, wow, this is Virginia plantation families in the 18th century. So this guy is living very, very well. At the age of 32, he's elected to the Continental Congress, and this was Virginia being a part of that revolution against the British government. And so he goes to Philadelphia to be a part of the Continental Congress, but he's a very, very odd member of that Congress. Whereas most of those guys kind of moved to Philadelphia, and they were there for more than a year, working on how to stage this revolution. Jefferson, he came in 1775 in April, and he stayed through till about August, and then he goes away for a while, and then he shows up again in November, and he stays till December, and then he goes away again, but he's only kind of in and out there. And then in 1776, he comes again in May, and then of course in July of 1776, they signed the Declaration of Independence, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So in a very short period of 6 weeks, after having been gone in and out, he comes back, and at the very end of the Continental Congress there, he writes the Declaration of Independence, and it's signed on July 4th, 1776. And then he almost immediately resigns his membership in the Continental Congress and goes back to Monticello. So he's kind of in and out, although when he's there, man, he's having a very big say and a very big influence. And then it turns out after that, he doesn't join the Revolutionary Army, and he certainly isn't involved in the same way that Alexander Hamilton was. So instead of fighting in the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson stays mostly back in Virginia, and he's elected to the representative body there in Virginia. Eventually he even becomes the governor of Virginia. But he's sort of back and forth between Richmond, which was the capital, and Williamsburg, which was an important heart of government there, and then back at Monticello. And in this period, he actually, when he was governor, had to move the capital because the British invaded and the armies were around there, and now the war had come to Virginia. And so he first flees to Monticello, and eventually he has to even leave Monticello and abandons it and thinks that it'll just be destroyed by the British troops. There was accusations of Jefferson later on that he maybe was there was a little cowardice, that he did not fight in the Revolutionary War, and in fact he fled, and he fled with the government of Virginia. But one of the reasons why he was not such a participant in the war was that his wife Martha was sick a lot during this period. And there was a kind of a pattern where he would go off somewhere for a while, either to Philadelphia or to Richmond or to Williamsburg, and he'd be gone, and she'd get sick, and he'd come home, and it was usually, she was pregnant, and she often was very ill during her pregnancies. They had 6 children. Only 2 of them lived to adulthood. They had 4 girls and 2 boys. Only 2 of the girls lived to adulthood. So she had these children who were ill, and she was ill in the pregnancies. And Jefferson was trying to take care of her to some extent. And then eventually in 1782, this is in the middle of the Revolutionary War, she dies. And at that point, he becomes a little more involved in the actual governance of the revolutionary effort. And so he begins to now go back to Philadelphia and to participate in some of these machinations of the revolution. And he is chosen to be the minister plenipotentiary to France, which means France has been recruited as an ally of the revolutionaries. And so he goes to Paris as the emissary of this revolutionary government and trying to get resources from them. He replaces Benjamin Franklin, who had been the minister plenipotentiary, and he stays there for 5 years. And during all of the end of the Revolutionary War, he's trying to get resources, trying to get money, trying to get support from France to help the colonies. And he's very, very effective in doing that. But he takes his slaves with him over there. He lives a pretty high life in Paris. He's a very erudite guy. He travels, he looks at architecture, which he loves. He becomes quite a gourmet of French food. He collects a lot of books. So he's he's living a pretty good life there, but he's also doing a very effective job of getting support for the revolutionary government. But then after the war is over and there is victory, he's been in France for 5 years, and then he returns to Philadelphia. So in 1790, Jefferson returns from Paris to Philadelphia. And at that point, a lot of hard work has been done. The war has been won, and there have the Constitution that has been written, and a lot of things that Alexander Hamilton had been involved in, all that's put to bed. George Washington is the new president of the United States. Washington is someone who Jefferson had known for quite a long time. And in some ways, similar to Alexander Hamilton, Washington had been a kind of surrogate father to Jefferson. He was very, very fond of Thomas Jefferson. Of course, Washington had no kids of his own, so these two young guys were very, very important to him. So George Washington was the president, and he selected Thomas Jefferson to be the Secretary of State. Of course, he had the experience of being in Europe during a good deal of the war, so he knew international affairs. That was a good match. And he embarks on the kind of contribution he was going to make to the country. And for example, he was Secretary of State for 4 years. He did not serve as Secretary of State in the second term of Washington. But then he became Vice President under John Adams for 4 years, and then, of course, in 1801 he became the President. Now, the thing that is important for us in this class is to think of how did he acquire certain values, and how did the background that he had, the family he came from, the experiences he had, how did those shape his values? Values like, for example, acquisition. I mean, here is a guy who his whole life was about acquiring things, acquiring land, acquiring books, acquiring servants, it was about acquiring things. And the good life was very important to him. And that kind of freedom to be who you wanted to be as an individual in that elite society, that was very, very important to Jefferson. And so that became a shaping value for him. Also, he had attitudes towards slavery that very much came out of his background. And he had values about all human beings and what role they would play in this new country. He also had interest in nature. He lived in a rural area. His father was a surveyor. He was always very interested in nature and agriculture and farming. And so that shaped his view of what America should be. He also had this suspicion of cities and of financial profiteering and banks, and he, as a landowner in Virginia, had to take some loans, and then if your crop went bad, it was difficult to pay those loans, and he saw bankers as kind of a bad thing. So all of this background, I think, set him up to have a set of values that were very different from Hamilton's, and very naturally became a point of some contention between he and Alexander Hamilton. So in the next talk, and certainly in our check-in, we want to be looking at how can we learn things about how he acquired values in his life experience and how we acquire values in our own life experience. Okay, see you later.